welcome back to my channel. My name is Cassie, and today we're going to be talking about my sewing journey. Yes, we are going to go back in time and discuss how I got started sewing, where I am now, and what are my plans for the future. If you like all of that, then definitely subscribe because there is more where that came from. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up because it really helps me out as I grow this channel and I can continue to reach you with lovely videos. Let me set the scene. It is 2019. I'm working full-time for a charity in marketing, but I have a little vintage side hustle where I sell vintage clothing, and I'm thinking about learning how to sew so that I can maybe do some upcycles and thrift flips and, sell those to add to my business. At some point in the year, I had confided to my partner that I was thinking about sewing, and for Christmas 2019, he gifted me a class to a workshop in Toronto to learn how to sew. I remember that night really vividly. It was cold. I didn't really want to go, to be honest. I was riding my bike, and it was just absolutely blizzarding, and it was in a pretty far part of the city from where I live. But I know he'd be really disappointed if I didn't go, and I figured I would enjoy it, so I made myself go, and when I got there, I loved it. I loved every second of it. I came back feeling really inspired, really wanting to sew, and then I did nothing because I didn't have a sewing machine. Fast forward a couple months later, it's the pandemic, everything gets locked down, we cannot leave our house, I get laid off from my job, no one is hiring, and I suddenly have a lot more time on my hands. And then I remembered that I learned how to sew. And maybe I should start doing that. The big issue, of course, and I think this is an issue for most people, is the supplies. So namely, I didn't have a sewing machine. And I think the sewing machine, for good reasons, is the barrier to entry for most people. It was definitely the barrier to entry for me. I had actually taken a sewing class years ago with a friend. I think it was like a 4-week class. And because I didn't have a sewing machine, it just kind of died off and I never practiced it again, and I definitely didn't remember anything when I started this class. So what do you do when you want to learn how to sew, but you don't have a sewing machine and you don't know if you're going to like it, so you don't want to spend a lot of money on it? And I think that this is a position that probably a lot of you have been in or maybe are in right now. And what I did was I borrowed a machine from a family member. Now, I know that this is not something that everyone can do. I was lucky that I was able to borrow the machine for, an extended period of time. So my advice to you is go to the thrift store or look on an online marketplace and find a machine that is used and within your price point. You actually don't have to spend over $100. You can find something under that. Kind of set your budget and try to find something within that. Really good vintage machine can be affordable as well. Just one thing I would say is to look up the model before you go pick it up so that you know that it has everything that it's supposed to have that comes with it. Even though I had the machine, I actually went pretty budget on everything else as well. For supplies, I bought everything pretty basic. I looked at reviews and I bought things that had good reviews but were on the more inexpensive side of the scale. I bought myself a pair of sewing shears. I bought myself a big ruler as well as a measuring tape. I bought myself a little pair of sewing snips, and I also got myself a chalk marker. The kit that I was using also came with some pins, but I did eventually buy some more pins. Oh, and I can't forget a seam ripper. Seam rippers always are very important. I got all of this for a pretty budget price because also remember, I had lost my job, so I was not working, I did not have an income, and so I was being really conscious about my spending. But for fabric, I also wanted to keep it pretty inexpensive, so I bought everything either thrifted or I deconstructed what I had in my wardrobe already. I played around with all the existing materials that were already available to me, and I just knew I didn't want to spend a lot of money on fabric because I was learning and everything I was making was pretty unwearable, I will tell you that. Learning how to sew does not have to be expensive. Aside from the initial investment, you don't need to buy a lot of expensive fabric or a lot of expensive materials to get going, I promise you. So how did I actually learn how to sew? Learning how to sew sort of happened in a variety of different ways. As I mentioned, I took that initial beginner sewing class, but it was really beginner. It certainly did not prepare me to sew garments. That did not stop me from trying. Some of my favorite resources were here on YouTube. I really relied on With Wendy and the Essential Club. In particular, I really love their videos on tracing your own clothes to make a pattern and then building a garment from there. That said, I was so beginner that I would have benefited from something that came even before those videos. Something that taught me about garments, something that taught me about the very, very, very basics of sewing your own clothes. Because sewing a pillowcase is very different from sewing a shirt or sewing pants or a skirt or any. One resource that I did find incredibly useful was a course from Closet Core Patterns on the recommendation of a friend. And essentially, it's a package of 3 patterns that come in a PDF, plus all these video lessons that guide you through from the very beginning of making your own clothes, seams and terminology and all of that good stuff. And then it will lead into the first pattern, which is a skirt, so starting at the most basic one, and then moving into a top or a dress, and then moving into the pants. Once I started to take that course, that was where I really started to see my skills develop. I really saw myself leveling up in my sewing practice, and that was where I really started to identify as a sewist and start to think about doing this, more long term, or at least have it be a part of my daily or weekly practice. As I mentioned, my first project was a pillowcase, and then I moved on to sewing patterns from With Wendy and the Essential Club. And while I really enjoyed the process of watching their videos and trying out different techniques that they were sharing, I really was not ready for it. And as a result, everything that I made during that time period was very ugly, very ugly and not wearable, and also just not even my style. Because at that point, I didn't really know how to sew for my style. I didn't know how to find the patterns, or I didn't know how to find the fabrics that matched with the patterns yet. I didn't know any of that stuff. The one thing that did make it out of that time period was a bucket hat. I made 5 of these bucket hats, but only one has made it through, and I still love that bucket hat so much. It is super flawed. It's got tons of intersecting lines instead of them being nice and parallel and neat. But I still love it, and it is a joy to wear. It makes me happy because I'm so proud of myself for getting to that point, making 4 bucket hats that I did not like before I got to the one that passed the test. And from there, I really started to realize that repetition was going to be pretty key for me. So I began making the same pattern more than once. I made these yellow top from Closet Core Patterns 3 times after I watched their tutorial. I made the Ilford jacket 3 or 4 times after I bought the pattern and also watched their videos on how to make the Ilford jacket. I made the same patterns over and over and over again, and I found that really helped teach me a new thing every single time. The first time was always kind of okay, second time always a little bit better, and the third time usually perfect. And as I was doing this, I really noticed that I was starting to understand not only how to pair fabrics with patterns better, but I was really learning how to understand my own style and what I would want to bring in and wear for a longer period of time. And one of the things that was the most pivotal to my growth was the sewing community. I was first introduced to the sewing community through the podcast Love to Sew. If you are familiar with sewing, you may be familiar with that podcast. I just found it amazing that I just typed into Google sewing podcast, really thinking that nothing would come up because I didn't know how big the sewing community really was at that point. But there was, first on the list was this podcast from 2 Canadian women who are about my age, who lived in the West Coast. They sounded so familiar. They sounded like my friends. Plus, I was in this really isolated time, as we all were during the pandemic, and I was looking for something to listen to that was not the news. So every day at dinner time, I popped on Love to Sew. I binged so many of their episodes, and as a result, I learned about so many indie pattern designers, indie patterns, the sewing community, hashtags, Instagram, Pinterest, all of the sewing resources that were on all these platforms. And I became so obsessed and immersed because I found this community of creative AF individuals who were making really cool things with their fabrics, who were really engaged with each other, offering advice. They were friends, they were resources for each other. The sewing blogs are amazing. There was so much out there. And so I found I really wanted to be a part of this community. And that's what kind of leads me to where I am right now. And where that is I'm no longer working, full-time in marketing anymore. I am working freelance. I also work part-time at a yoga studio, and I kind of do my own thing, and I'm figuring it out as I go. It's definitely a little light on work currently, but I'm working on boosting my YouTube presence. I'm also working on growing my other communities, like on Instagram and on TikTok. I've made a really amazing community on both of those platforms, and I'm continuing to do freelance copywriting, content creation, all that good stuff that I really love. I think for me, this sort of mix of my freelance, the yoga studio, and YouTube really allows me to work on the things that I like doing. And so while I'm maybe not in my dream position right now, I know that I have the time to work towards it and to get there. And I feel like I'm pretty close. And then looking forward, where do I want to go? What is the future for me? Well, I think For one, I'm going to keep sewing and sharing and building those communities. I would love to eventually start a sewing club in my city or even an online sewing club. I think that would be really fun. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about. Is that community around sewing and how, sewing can be so individual. I'm really missing the community aspect. So that's something that has been on my mind. I really want to focus on making patterns from as many indie designers as I can. I've found that following indie pattern instructions has really been key in my growth process because they can be so well written and teach you so much as you go. And so I would love to do more indie patterns, just do as many as possible, and maybe eventually work towards writing my own patterns, drafting my own patterns, and doing that whole thing, because that seems like a really fun next step. But for now, I'm really enjoying being a maker and an explorer and sharing the results of like what I make and what I find as I go. So that's kind of the direction that I'm hoping to go in, and I'm really excited to see how it all develops. So with the community in mind, I want to say thank you so much for being here, whether you're new or whether you are returning. I really appreciate you watching this video and interacting however you choose to, whether that's a like, a comment, a share, any of that good stuff. I really do appreciate it. And if you want to hang out a little bit more, because I definitely want to hang out with you, please find me on TikTok and Instagram at makingcassie, and obviously subscribe so that we can be here every single week. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate you, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your week. I will see you next time. Bye.